Hi, thank you all for coming to the 6th edition of the program called Filmic 6, which is dedicated to women filmmakers who made an important impact on film history but have been excluded or overlooked in the official film canon. This year's edition is dedicated to video artist and filmmaker Barbara Hammer. We had the first screening yesterday, and today we're going to see her film Nitrate Kisses, and then again we have 2 more films tomorrow. And here with us is Elene Gorfinkel. She is a film scholar, film critic, and senior lecturer at the in film studies at the King's College in London. And here with us she will give a lecture called Barbara Hammer, Carnal Histories and Gentle Frictions. So thank you, Elena, for joining us here in Zagreb. And after the lecture, we will also have a short Q&A, so you can feel free to ask questions. And yeah, so I give you the mic.
Great. So can you hear me? Thank you. Can you hear me okay? The mic works? Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dina and Docukino, and all the other organizations responsible for inviting me and bringing me here to talk to you about Barbara Hammer's work and her tremendous legacy for women's films, for lesbian and queer cinema, and the intersecting histories of experimental film practice and nonfiction filmmaking, which is a very vast and fascinating topic. But I wanted to begin, in a sense, with a detour that's not really a detour, and you'll see the connection as I talk. Dina invited me and asked me to talk about questions, in addition to talking about Hammer, and it's not unrelated, but to talk about questions of canon formation, film culture, and its relation to women's film histories. And I think it was prompted, I gather, by an essay I wrote, seen here, called Against Lists, which I wrote in 2019 in the feminist film journal Another Gaze. It was written on the cusp of the turn of the decade of 2020, and it was just before the pandemic hit. And at the time, there was a real ramping up of a frenzy of list making that was taking place and was commemorating the unit of time of the decade, not just the end of the year, but the end of a decade. And all varieties of the frenzy of best of films were being enumerated, and not least of which was a rather depressing list released by the BBC, which had 100 best list of women-made films, which included, among other depressing facts within it, Leni Riefenstahl's films. So, what motivated my essay was the feeling that there was no better or no good list that could ameliorate or solve the culture of list making itself as a compulsory and consolidating of a unified field of taste. And there was no good list that could critique the politics that inhered within list making, the politics of the claim of aesthetic objectivity. So the culture of list making and the reconstitution of a status quo taste maintained very particular exclusions, and I thought an incuriousness in film culture, in which the machine of content production was fed by listicles and a ceaseless flow of clickbait rather than serious or in-depth engaged film writing. And particularly if one looked at any individual list before or after I wrote the essay, you might find a wager that for my money usually persists, which is, and I hate sort of taxonomies, but this is in a way something that I see over and over again, which is if you look at any given list of 10 films, there are usually 0 to 1 women on that list, or queer filmmakers for that matter, and so that you can test this on your own time. But so there seemed to be something about the form of the list itself and the terms of the constitution of what counts as something that could be listed that itself was, to me, contaminated. So the essay was meant to be a performance work, and in a way, a bit of a song or a ditty in its rhythms, a provocation to think differently, and a dare to step outside the hallowed circle of some coherent understandings of what one might prioritize as a collective, or if one wanted to make a claim for some kind of collective form of film culture. So the impulse to write this also came from a sense that the work of cinephilia happens elsewhere, in the sinuous and more entangled processes of film writing, film programming and curating, and in small publications and festivals on the sidelines of larger institutions of power and influence. In independent venues like this one, micro-cinemas, and small pockets of cinematic dissidence that exist apart from mainstream, the commercially driven film culture. And historically speaking, this is also particularly where women have been located. They have not been missing or marked by some lack or absence, but abundantly there all along, tending to each other's films and maintaining their circulation in small and local ways. One thinks of filmmaker and programmer figures like Laura Mulvey and Claire Johnston, who worked on the 1972 Edinburgh Women's Film Festival, or the experimental German filmmaker Ute Arand, who in the 80s began showing films by women on 16 millimeter in a very celebrated film series, including a film that I adore, and I'm also writing about, a screening of Wanda by Barbara Loden. And we might also look at Peggy Awash and M.M. Sarah, both experimental filmmakers, who recovered and screened the work of the adult filmmaker Doris Wishman, who had made many, many films very prolifically in the 60s. So they were there all along, and they were tending to each other's work all along. Rather than the impossibly crass superlatives of mastery, greatest, best, and also the one I love, all time, right? I've been interested in the minor marginal spaces where women and queer makers have long congregated in microcinemas and zines and indie film publications to talk about, draw life from, and commune within the temporality of difference, to breathe in the life of other histories and other times and generations, rather than abiding by some preconceived standard bearer of the unitary or the same. In that spirit, I summoned the image of Barbara Hammer in the essay, among other recently or not so recently departed filmmakers, to ask, this is a quote from the list essay, who will ask Barbara Hammer, Kathleen Collins, Kira Muratova, or Sarah Gomez for their lists? In this regard, I meant that not only were these filmmakers not asked for their lists, nor could they be, nor might they want to be asked, or might they want to produce a list, but because they had passed away, that the attention to women filmmakers always comes too little, too late, to register as a marking of a concrete or official genealogy. So the predilection for women artists like Hammer, like Carolee Schneemann, like Alice Neal, the painter, or filmmakers like Muratova, Collins, Loden, is likely to accrue, if not very late in life, in a frenzy of condescending mimification. And you might think of the cardboard cutout of Agnes Varda that followed her in her late life auteurification. Then posthumously. It's hard not to be swept away on a principle of negativity and to think that film culture prefers its women artists as fresh corpses rather than as living agents. But there's also a responsibility here not to reinscribe the terms of such predilections for absence, disappearance, and the romance of lack and loss. Such rhetorical framings are heady and powerful intoxicants, these romances of lack or failure that often obscure as much as they reveal or clarify. So like Hammer, and this is a still from Nitrate Kisses, which we'll see this evening. Like Hammer, many of the women artists before her worked at the precipice, without precedence and without a net or an official legible genealogy of her stories. As Hammer would attest, when she would speak of her inspiration, by the legacy of the tremendous high priestess and architect of the post-war American avant-garde, Maya Deren. Her tribute to Deren, which we saw last night, there's an image of it from the prior slide, Maya Deren's sink, also attests to that devotion. Hammer, who recounts her first encounter with Deren's films when she went to film school and when she took a film history course, accounts for this moment of revelation. And here is a quote from an essay that she wrote called Maya Deren and Me, of this moment of clarity that came to her when she saw the films of Deren, like Meshes of the Afternoon and At Land. And she says, finally there appeared on the screen the black and white 60mm films of Maya Deren. Something was radically different. For the first time, a woman's cinema filled the screen in this dark, cavernous lecture hall. Until then, this history of cinema screen had been blank from a woman's point of view. Seeing the blank screen, I knew for certain that I would make film. And so this sense that list making as an implicit aide-memoire to history writing is still a history that's written often from above in those history of film classes. And it's written from a collective unconscious that is ruled, sorry, I thought I had slept this. Apologies. List making is still governed by a history that comes from a collective unconscious that's ruled by a psychic apparatus that was for long. Alex, it's my partner. I just sent him a picture of myself, sorry. Let me try to turn this off. Hilarious. Anyhow, so I'm gonna have to tell him to stop texting me. List making as an implicit aide-memoire to history writing is a history written from above and from a collective unconscious that is ruled by a psychic apparatus that for very long has very little questioned. What undergirds such practices are also often canon formations by other means, unspoken criteria of form and content. List making becomes a field of intuitive choices and immutable aesthetic categories, a minefield for the reproduction of predispositions towards a model of genius that is hewed closely to the framework of prolific, well-funded, large-scale feature-length fiction film production, preferentially afforded to an industrial model of filmmaking associated with big studio, capital-intensive production, a domain of filmmaking historically and largely still made by men. This is not where most women found harbor and community to make the cinema of their personal dreams and collective imaginations. For this domain, we have to look elsewhere, to the domain of independent, experimental, and nonfiction film practices, precisely where Hammer operated, driven not by commercial or aesthetic conventions or imperatives, but by a principle of self-discovery and self-making. So what if we proceeded from a principle of abundance rather than lack, following on the provocation of an exhibition like that of Erika Balsam and Hila Pelegs from last year at the Hochhava in Berlin, No Master Territories, Feminist World-Making and the Moving Image, we can step into the fold of history armed with the precision of a different set of aesthetic and political criteria, ones that hew to margins, to formal messiness, to hybrid and less legible historical practices that sit at the border of experimental and nonfiction modes. To deregulate the canon, to break down the ossified categories that reinscribe and repeat the same litany of names year after year, list after list, we have to look at the work itself and the lives themselves, to see in their weft and warp the striving of many feverish, indefatigable imaginations to make it otherwise. This brings us to the abundance of Barbara Hammer's oeuvre, there all along, if we care to look. The Titanic filmmaker, artist, and firebrand Barbara Hammer, who left this mortal earth, but not our hearts, minds, and imaginations, at the age of 79, left behind, by my count, on this screen here, what appear to be 99 film works, and countless other works of painting. Oh, did something, oh, sorry. I don't know why. Can someone, let me escape. I don't know why. Hold on a second. Hold on. Aha, okay. Did you see this slide? Okay. I'll just go back a little bit. Where was I? I think I may have just timed out or something. So Barbara Hammer, by my count, left behind at the age of 79, 99 film works, based on this count from her actual website, which catalogs all of her activity, as well as countless other works of painting, drawing, installation, performance, diaries, poems, and personal and theoretical writing. And I had to make this page really like the font, like a 6-point font to fit it all into one slide. So you can't actually see that, I mean, maybe you can see the titles, but you should just go to her website. Hammer's work is truly a monumental feat of self-making and self-imagining, and the force of her legacy is bequeathed by the very embodied and activist ways she lived both her art and her life. She was the first lesbian to make films of lesbian lovemaking, and along with her contemporaries, such as the bisexual Constance Beeson and the Honey Lee Cottrell, among the first to represent queer women's sexuality in a gloriously explicit and tactile fashion, one suited to a moment in which gay liberation emboldened queer women to find a voice by picking up a camera. Hammer shifted from writing poetry and heterosexuality to filmmaking and becoming a woman-loving woman in 1968. She left her husband, with whom she had adventured on motorcycles around the world, as well as built a house from scratch in the woods in California, and forged ahead to make a new cinematic language. Coming out as a lesbian for Hammer was a coming into the fold of cinema, and her narratives of her enthrallment by the women's movement, her new awareness of lesbianism as desire, as community, as collectivity, as conviviality, and her interest in filmmaking as a distinct practice were coextensive. She was electrified by the thrill of touching a woman, and that thrill of touch and its complexity became one of the key aesthetic and sensory logics of her oeuvre. That sense of tactility, the haptics, which we talked about last night, but we'll see more of today and this evening. There's definitely this adventurousness and spirit of independence and exploration throughout her work. And we see it in even her earliest films, one of her first films, Skitsy, made in 1968, where she picks up a camera, a Super 8 camera in this case. Super 8, small gauge format, primarily an amateur format, and also one used by experimental filmmakers. And in this early film, which you can watch, I think it's available on UbuWeb, I'm not sure, actually sure. In this film, we see Hammer grappling with this roving handheld camera, and she's flush with the excitement of navigating her environment through the lens of the camera. And in this particular shot, we see the handling of the camera becoming an exploration of the bounds and the limits of looking, this reorganization of space and time. In this shot, she goes over the body to the feet of a man, and then in this subsequent shot, there's another, I don't know why people are texting me right now. Sorry. In this shot, we have this shot where she goes again over the feet of another man, and has him hold between his feet a mirror in which we see her face. And so there's this kind of reorganization of point of view that is happening, even in these early films, where she's really interested in the bounds of how the camera can look. And this, so in this sense, the coming out for Hammer was a coming into the fold of cinema. and as I've said. And so there's this way that grappling with the filmic materiality was also this way of reconstituting herself, remaking herself. And I think it's important to recognize the way that Hammer was also working within a context. She wasn't entirely aware of other work that was being made in the decade before she picked up a camera. And she became aware as she traveled with her films well into the 70s. But I think it's important to situate her films in relationship to a genealogy of feminist art and filmmaking and activism that was largely located within the avant-garde. Maya Deren, who we've talked about, who was a really important figure in the 40s and 50s, who established a network of film circulation for experimental films because she would travel with her films to universities and was a avid advocate and also theorist of cinema. For example, her notion about the anagram on kind of notions of horizontality and verticality, nonlinear forms of time. These were all very much taken up by Hammer. But there are also other women working around the same time, which we mentioned last night as well. Carolee Schneemann, whose film Fuses is an important, I think, precedent, which Hammer wasn't aware of. But Schneemann was a feminist performance artist who was working out of a tradition of abstract expressionism, but also modifying that tradition and moving into expanded cinema happenings and into filmmaking itself as a way of staging this collision of the border between questions of painting, performance, and cinema through her film practice. In this image, you see this performance work of hers called I Body, in which she stages herself in front of the camera. And this sense of self-representation for all of these filmmakers was quite central, right? These are filmmakers and performance artists and artists who put their body in the image and they were foregrounding themselves. And this was a really important intervention for them that was very riven through with questions that feminism was asking about what it meant to be kind of a woman, to be embodied as a woman in a kind of sexist, patriarchal, capitalist culture. Another figure we might think of is the Fluxus artist, filmmaker, musician, multi-hyphenate Yoko Ono, whose work Cut Piece in the mid-60s also placed herself in the center of the work as a site of vulnerability and contact. Right? She's inviting the audience to engage with her in a very, very, I think, fractious and confrontational way in Cut Piece, where she invites people to cut off her clothes. And it's both a scene of intimacy as well as incredible risk, this performance work. And we might also see Hammer's work connected to filmmakers like Gunvor Nelson and Dorothy Wiley, who made the film Schmierguns, which you see on the top left, which was a film that was made when they borrowed their husbands' cameras. They both had partners who were experimental filmmakers, and they'd never made a film before. And around them, they were seeing advertising images and kind of popular culture that advertised images of women to themselves that was not what they experienced their life to be. They had children, one of them was pregnant, and so they combined this image, media cultural image from popular culture and cut it in this really rapid, energetic montage with the actual dirty and unseemly textures of domestic life as a mother or as a kind of child rearer. And so that all of these things that were suppressed in the surface of popular culture by the image of a sanitized image of woman came to the surface. The shitty diapers, the clogged toilets, all of these images then kind of erupt forward in a film like Schmierguns. And Schmierguns, for its focus on beauty standards and conventions, also inspired activists who saw the film to protest the Miss America pageant, and which was documented in the film Up Against the Wall, Miss America. In 1968, a very important action for the development of the second wave feminist movement and the solidification of a set of demands, a set of criteria, a set of ways of critiquing society as it existed. And in this image, we obviously see, this is from Fuses, which was an important work by Schneemann, in which she documented for over the course of 3 years her life and lovemaking with her partner James Tenney, who was a musician, sound artist, and in which she condensed in a 30-minute film this documentation, as well as processing and materialization of their life together and their kind of intimate encounter together in her home. And she subjected the film and edited the film and subjected it to many processes, including baking it, hanging it out in the outside, cutting it with acid, and painting on it. And so there are all of these chemical and alchemical processes that were also manifested. And so these are all, in a sense, part of a genealogy that I think Hammer entered into. But in her understanding, she wasn't at the time when she began and entered into filmmaking. She wasn't necessarily aware of these, these other artists. But I think it's interesting to think about them within a continuum and the ways that they all, in a sense, foregrounded their own bodies, kind of the question of bodily experience, sexuality as a site of radicality and kind of radical transformation of the world as it exists, and as a site for alternative forms of experience. All of these things, I think, connect to Hammer's, the imperatives of Hammer's cinema. Hammer frequently talked about the idea that radical content requires radical form. And in the 70s, as she began to make films, she focused quite a lot on sexual experience, bodily extension, self-representation, and the activation of a lesbian form of looking. Her cinema seized on the camera and the event of shooting as a machine for making the senses and translating them, capturing and giving shape to sensory experience and carnal existence. And in that sense, that element of carnality is not something that is necessarily reduced to sexuality, but is something, about kind of how one inhabits one's body in relationship to the environment, in one's environment and others, is something that I think connects all periods of her filmmaking in different ways. There's always this emphasis on the sensorial. But here I think we have a set of motifs that organize her films from the 70s and onwards, particularly their drive of lesbian feminist politics, in which, in which kind of the emergence of the feminist movement also kind of facilitated and created rifts as well between kind of lesbian feminists and kind of not, kind of heterosexual feminists. And these sorts of politics were being sort of argued out in this period. And I think we see this question of visibility and invisibility that was really central to a lot of Hammer's work. For example, in her performance piece from the late 70s, here what we see, that put a lesbian on the White House. And I think another important strand is this question of self-representation, which in her later work connects to this question of biography and autobiography. How does one write the self? How, this is an incredibly important motif that I think we see across her films, and I think we'll see it in a different way tonight when we watch Nitrate Kisses, when she moves to the histories of other lives that are occluded by history. But I think throughout there is a real sense of joy, a kind of sense of queer joy, and this valuing of the intelligence of experience and the intelligence of what the body can tell one about how to remake the world. And that is, I think, represented as well in this sense of play and performance that we see in Hammer's films. Dyke Tactics is an important, very important work that I think, if any film one associates with Hammer, this might be the one that most people know about. It's a 4-minute film. We watched it last night, and it was the beginning of this trajectory of establishing this very tactile cinema, a cinema that foregrounded lesbian sensuality, in which she was really interested in a question of erotic time, as well as a sense of communality and commonality, this question of, question of sameness and difference that played out in the lesbian erotic encounter. And so she was recovering not just merely a sexual notion, but an image of communality in the way that she filmed her friends who went into the woods to kind of frolic, perform rituals, to be with each other in this performative play. And Hammer talked about the film, and this is one of the shots that the camera person, she both used a camera person, a friend, to film, but then she also, in certain shots in the film, she asked the camera person to just put the camera on the ground so that it would have this sense of, a different sense of closeness or independence in relationship to the bodies, but also kind of be with the bodies in a certain way. But there is this sense of, in this shot, of the camera as like a third participant that is refiguring what the boundary of boundaries of mutuality are. In her writing about didactics, she talked about this notion of erotic time, and she stated she was quite interested in different kinds of nonlinear time, and this is something that she drew from Darren's cinema as well and Darren's writing. But I think that she was looking at sexual experience and erotic experience, sensuality, as a site of imagination. And so she wrote that didactics is erotic time. It is not made with the Freudian belief that the sublimation of erotic energy into creative psychological pursuits is the only hope of a civilized society. And then she goes on to say that Freud was proven wrong for this if we look at our kind of capitalistic patriarchal society. And she goes on to say that didactics is the free and joyful expression of direct erotic energy. Art is directly sexual. The erotic time was edited kinesthetically, and the images were edited by and for the sense of touch. Images of touching, eating, cleaning, washing, digging, climbing, stroking, licking, bathing, budding, hugging. Textural editing, feel it feels good, a lesbian commercial. So there is this kind of real sense of this pleasure, like kind of proceeding from a principle of pleasure rather than negation, proceeding from a sense of the kind of fundamental intelligence and integrality of lived experience. Hammer also talked about, and if we think about this, the connection between her kind of coming out and becoming a lesbian feminist and the films she made, I think this notion of herself of self-birthing is really important. And we see it in it manifests in different ways in different aspects of her cinema of the 70s, which is very much this observational cinema, short films made primarily on 16 millimeter, where she's documenting her life in different ways, but also syncopating it, editing it rhythmically, trying to get at different qualities of rhythm. But I think within it, we see this notion of the lesbian, as she says, lesbian film artist births herself. And this connection to history, which is a thread, the title of my talk is Carnal Histories, and there's a reason for that, in that Hammer, in these processes of self-documentation, was always very aware of the way that she needed to document her own life and give shape to her own life, a life lived in cinema, through cinema, as a way of writing her own history. So there was this way that documenting, using the camera, making these films in this profuse, prolific manner, out of a fundamental curiosity, voraciousness, joy, was something that was driven as well by an understanding that she would, as she said, because she didn't have lesbian artists that she could study, she wanted to study her own life. And she says, by doing so, make work that attempts to partly fill the dearth of lesbian herstory for lesbians of the 21st century. So there's this really specific understanding of history that I think is really, really important to understanding Hammer's films. We see this also in the very unapologetic, sensually exploratory and orgasmic viewpoint that she takes in some of her films, particularly a film like Multiple Orgasm, made in 1976, in which she fuses her own body in ecstasy with sublime presence of natural images and landscapes, staging the monumentality of magisterial landscapes against the shattering of her own self, in jouissance, in Multiple Orgasm. So rather than a phallocentric logic that was organized to the cut of a male desire, as Laura Mulvey wrote just 1 year prior to the making of this film, Hammer destabilized subject and object by presenting, like Schneemann, a window onto her own unsimulated pleasure. In Hammer's Multiple Orgasm, she uses superimposition to relate the ecstatic throes of her own self-pleasure. And she collects within the film 8 orgasms that are registered in images of both her face and her vulva, which fill the screen in superimposition. And they're superimposed onto mobile shots of her camera scanning across craggy, majestic rock formations in the Southwest. The play with the relationship of the nude and the exposed body as refigured landscapes also critiques histories of landscape as itself a neutralized transferal of the feminine as sublimity. And the evanescence and ephemerality of sexual release is saturated ironically by the monumentality and geological temporality of stone, the creases and folds of rock with labia and vulva. If the female orgasm at this time remained elusive and was fantasized as located in more pornographic cinema like Deep Throat, which in that film the clitoris was relocated to the woman's throat, the clitoris kind of suddenly magically shifting to a site where it might pleasure male desire, Hammer offered her own corrective, pairing her own interior pleasure, her own private, intimate space with exteriorized images of solidity, stasis, permanence, the most fleeting paired with the most constant, the most occluded with the most monumental, to assert the scale of female pleasure as its own incontrovertible presence, as concrete as stone and rock, as significantly mammoth as the mountainside. In an era in which sexual science had rediscovered the clitoris as a site of female pleasure, that dispensed with the perceived need for vaginal penetration as a route to climax, the clitoris had been a threat and a mystery, one that's demystified in Hammer's images, but also made, in a sense, pedagogically present, a scene of potential instruction as well as performed and exuberant ecstasy. By showing her own shadow here, there's another layer. Hammer inserts the scene of filmmaking and the reflexive manifestation of her own figure into the image. So she's watching herself, but also a traveler within the images of her own documented pleasures, blown up to the scale of that impervious, expansive stone. And also, in a sense, an image of self-birthing of another sort. Another film from this period was also a rather significant film that also came with a body of critique around it. This film, among with some of the others I've mentioned, in particular, was taken up as an irritant to feminist theory of the time. This film, which we saw last night, features shots of vegetal forms, plants, fruits, that are set alongside images of women, close-ups of faces, as well as of lovemaking, often filmed of Hammer, showing cunnilingus with her lover, or in this negative image of kissing and intimate embrace with a cat on the back of her lover. And so this sense of a fusion, a juxtaposition of the natural world with feminine sexuality and the female body created a problem, and I think was seen as a site of a problematic notion of this reduction. So some feminists who were schooled in theories, kind of post-structuralist theories, and kind of had a very suspicious view of dominant forms of representation, saw in Hammer's cinema this manifestation of a reduction to bodiness by which women were frequently plagued. Feminist film theory and feminist theory at the time, and scholarship and also discussion amongst activist communities often came back to this question of whether one could represent a woman at all, whether the camera itself was somehow fundamentally, and the cinema as an apparatus was fundamentally inscribed with patriarchal logics. This is something that we see, for example, that undergirds an argument that is made in Laura Mulvey's writing of the visual pleasure essay, but elsewhere. And I think that this is something that Hammer took to heart in the sense that she was aware of these criticisms, and there was a kind of a claim of essentialism ultimately, that her films were associated with a kind of essentializing of female sexuality into some kind of universal form or some kind of purity that is linked to the natural. And that is something that feminists at the time wanted to critique, this mystification of the female body, this kind of, that emerges in the dominant cinema through forms of fetish and spectacle. In contrast to that logic of skepticism or negativity, Hammer's route was in fact an affirmative one. And there's a sense in which, looking back at those debates now, we can see how Hammer's approach to history, her understanding of her writing of her own history, her fundamentally reflexive approach to the image really articulates this claim of essentialism as a really wrong-headed one. And she herself also wrote about this later in the 80s, but I think she took it to heart because her films shifted in the 80s, and she decided to take bodies for a time. She took bodies out of her cinema. And I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. But she also wrote about this critique and said that that she was really interested in affirmation and an affirmative approach, because she said that there was no lesbian cinema to deconstruct because the image didn't yet exist. For the image to be deconstructed, it needed to exist, and she needed to create it for then to have the semiotic. She said you couldn't have a signifier without the image itself being made. And so she was the person making these images, right? And so the assertion of lesbian existence itself had to take place first. So, and she wrote about this, that we discovered who we were as we stepped into the void, the invisible, the blank screen, and named ourselves lesbians. That was the first step. And she said that this reinforcement of presence through lesbian sexuality is quite different from a sense of lack. I find it to be identity reaffirming, strengthening in self-sense. This is lesbian making, this love making we women do with one another. This is not a statement of essentialism, although some may call it so. So, and she makes a claim for that this isn't a kind of something that reduces female sexuality to one thing, or lesbianism to one thing, that it's actually rather multiple. But this question of placing the lesbian on screen to begin with, I think, was a really important part of the kind of politics of her cinema in the 70s. But she was very much kind of had to speak back to these critiques and talk about the multiplicity of lesbian and feminist life. And the other claim that she made was that experimental film in particular was outside those dominant hegemonic modes of representation. That's something that's often lost also, I find, in discussions of Laura Mulvey's essay, which is applied to all kinds of cinema uniformly, when in fact she was talking about a particular mode of filmmaking in classical Hollywood studio filmmaking at a particular time. The notion of the male gaze was very much bounded to that particular mode of production. How can we apply it then to this incredibly artisanal, personal cinema of a woman with a camera with her lover, right? These are very different models of filmmaking, and so they require different theories. And one could see that, in a sense, Hammer, by making these films, was also giving us keys to a way of theorizing them, and a way, in the way that she was imagining herself, imagining this different mode and different language. And so she sought different tactics in the 80s. And the early 80s, she moved to New York City. She had lived in San Francisco for a long time, but she decided she thought her love life had stalled, according to her memoir, as well as the fact that she wanted to be where the art scene was. And so she moved to New York in this period, and she also shifted for a time her strategies and expanded to the extent that her work was always expansive. In the 70s, she was making performance work, she was drawing, painting, and so on. She also, she shifted to a kind of exploration of space, and for a time left, it was still very embodied cinema, but it was one that didn't necessarily always include lesbian sexuality. So she shifted her focus to a kind of phenomenal experience of landscapes and perceptual experience. And one film that I wanted to show you, which is actually, it's on a very bad copy, which is I'm showing you, is on YouTube, is called Bent Time. And in it, it spoke to this way that she was thinking about the medium itself. And it was inspired by a scientific discovery that she had read about, that at the edges of the universe where light bends, and implicitly what is assumed by that is that time also bends. So it presents a logic in which time is not linear because of this curve at the edge of the universe. And she decided to make a film using an incredible wide-angle lens, 9mm wide-angle lens on 16mm film, in which she would traverse across spaces. So in a sense, this was a travel film. She moved across different landscapes in the film, from San Francisco to New York, from Ohio burial mounds to Chaco Canyon, and then into spaces like the Guggenheim. And she used a principle of using what she said was 1 frame per 1 foot of distance. And it was, in a way, she's sort of using her own walking across space and accelerating it, but also expanding. So pointing to the limits of the frame, the rectangular frame of the screen itself, and pointing to the curvature of the earth. Pause it there. It's about a 30-minute long film, and you can watch it on YouTube. So there is still, even with the absence of, we really still feel the sense of the filmmaker's own traversal and engagement with the environment as really fundamental. There's a sense of like perceptual adventure as well, of bending the limits of space and time. One of the aspects of Hammer's cinema is also, I think, an important, is an important approach to spectatorship. And she often, rather than thinking about her audience as passive, trapped in this somnambulant dream state, which is a mode we might associate with the dream screen of entering into a narrative fiction feature film. Hammer often invited the spectator's participation in really specific ways, both at the level of form, at the level of the way there's this address to the crossing of different sensations of touch, taste, smell, and sight and sound, and these contrapuntal relations within them, but also in the way that she incorporated the audience into her filmmaking. And this is nowhere more evident than in this film called Audience from 1982, which is a really extraordinary document because it's a reflexive film in which Hammer interviews her public and her spectators in different cities. And she makes a film in which the spectators are also responding to each other. So the audience in different cities see each other and then comment on that in addition to the other films that she shows of her work. And so there is this sense of this developing dialogue and this production of a lesbian feminist screening public and a spectator that is activated by her cinema. And so I'm going to show you two clips from this film because it's really extraordinary. And it gives you a feeling for both Hammer as a person and her sense of joy and exuberance, but also her engagement with those kind of an invitation of critique in the space of reception of her films. Let me just set this up. Okay, I'll start it here, sorry.
Which audience primarily reacted to this lesbian trapeze film?
Well, they weren't used to seeing women's nude bodies on the screen. Lesbians.
I hope to see some films about women who are like me, hopefully.
What are you like?
Well, I'm maybe different from some other women.
I like your beard.
Thank you. That's
You
what
know,
makes me a little bit different.
I have a series of portraits of women with beards.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I'd love to see them.
I'd like
sometime.
to have you in them.
I'd love to be in them.
Sensual, sexual feeling in its audience, and that promotes that and promotes it among women, which is what I love about your films.
I'm hoping to see lesbian art in a positive image, something beautiful, hopefully.
I came to see something I rarely get to see in the cinema, a point of view that is rarely seen, and I came to be very excited by it. Hopefully.
And why did you come tonight?
I'd like to see something positive, something different.
Do you think women get turned on by cinema?
Some cinema.
You'd like to see some nice erotic things?
Very well done, erotic, sensual movies.
Is that what you expect?
No, I just came to see you live and well without toxic shock.
Thank you.
If you're Barbara Hammer, I haven't seen any of your movies in years, and I want to see what you're doing now.
I just expect to see a lot of lesbians enjoying a wonderful film before Gay Pride Day. Looks really good.
Are you from out of town?
I live here. I live in San Francisco, yeah.
I expect to see 10 years of films, one from each year, that describes you, and I'm looking forward to it. Very much.
You're a VD epidemiologist.
Yes. I ask people
I'm
who
going
they
to
have
fast
sex
forward
with.
just a little bit. The man we just saw is also an important queer filmmaker, Kurt McDowell, who died of AIDS-related causes in the 80s. And Hammer was really good friends with him and also made a film that was motivated in part by her kind of grief over his death among other friends. But he was a really important kind of cult queer filmmaker who worked with George Kuchar and Mike Kuchar in San Francisco and taught filmmaking in San Francisco and made a number of films. So there's this way that there's this collating of an idea of a community that we have, right, and of these different publics. The woman that she's talking to here is a woman who works in a clinic and is coming to see the film out of a more pedagogical interest, and so there's also these intersecting communities that are being shown here. And I'm going to show you just a scene from, I think was quite funny because I live in the UK, but a British audience in London reacting to both her films and also the prior audience, the recordings of the audiences in San Francisco, to give you a feeling for a very different group of women who are observing her films. So let me just find it in the... There you go. Okay, I'm just going to play a few minutes.
Well, I was saying before that it's very difficult for me to get into the second film because I was so inspired by the American women shrieking and shouting and so confident and powerful that it was very hard to kind of tone down to the calmness and the corridors and spaces at the next film. I loved it.
The second time around, I noticed much more strongly how strong the women in San Francisco were and how different it was. Just the whole feeling, the lesbian scene in San Francisco, how different and how much more exciting and how much everyone seemed to know more about what was going on and were much more relaxed.
Okay, what I wanted to say in reply to an American woman, I don't know where she comes from in the States. Oh, from right, anyhow, she was saying that she was embarrassed by the people in the audience film. And many of the British women here were saying that we thought that it was really exciting to see those women because they had a sense of humour, a wackiness that was a joy to see and a great energy as well.
Were they embarrassing for you to hear two women in love with each other in rather a romantic, mushy, but let's face it, probably true way?
No, not really. It did shock me in a way though, because you don't kind of see that much stuff on film, you know? You don't see it often. But in a way, it was really exciting to see it and to actually think, God, yeah, that's what it's like, you know? That's really good.
The only thing that I can remember that shocked me about the whole lot of the films was that shot of the vagina, which I found incredibly raw and almost pornographic. I couldn't really distinguish where you drew the line, in a sense, how that line is drawn. That's the one thing that really struck me.
Yeah, there's quite a discussion between the difference of erotica and pornography.
And I am a lesbian. I would prefer to be called a woman filmmaker. And I'm not passionate about seeing nude bodies. I'm not passionate about seeing vaginas and clitorises. I'm certainly not passionate about seeing penises either. But I sort of would like it to be... I'm not passionate about feeling women are strong. I know they're strong. And I don't have to see them trapezing in the nude to know they're strong. I would like it a little more underplayed.
I really like, as I said before, that I really like the idea of starting with the film The Audience and then actually thinking about what lesbian cinema is about and then moving into films which are so different to what one's preconceptions are of lesbian cinema. And what also I like is the sense of energy that the films have.
So there's this great sense of like this range of reactions and that are in opposition to each other, and this sense of like the diversity of ways of engaging that Hammer is gathering and collating and having the friction between these positions and reactions speak to each other, but also constitute a notion of a lesbian public sphere, which I think is in this feedback loop. In which there's this sense of a community that is being formed in distance across geographical boundaries that I think is quite remarkable, and also speaks to that tension between the immediacy of the present as it's felt, but also this sense of attempting to write a history and attempting to, that impulse to document and observe and record is very driven by the sense of like gathering for posterity, gathering for the future, a notion of that impress of existence of lesbian lives. And this, in a sense, connects, I know that how much time do we have technically? I can just Okay. I'll try to cover up to Nitrate Kisses at least. This connects to this notion that Hammer talked about, is this idea of the active viewer. And this is something that she writes about in this essay, important essay from the early 90s called The Politics of Abstraction. And so because she works in part in experimental film and also with strategies of abstraction, abstraction often means something that is sort of formalist, bereft of a social context or politics, whereas she was reconfiguring and shifting the terms of what abstraction means in relationship to a political position, and that is connected to this notion of the activation of the audience, in which she talks about that the viewer must be active. And she says that active audience members don't lose a sense of themselves while engaging in the physical sensations of abstract cinema, but feel more the possibility of being. And that sense of possibility of being, I think we see in a lot of her films as they move into the late 80s. For example, a film like Optic Nerve, which it was an experimental, like very avant-garde film, still a short, that was inspired and drew on footage of her visiting her grandmother. Her mother died of cancer in the mid-70s, and she was very close with her grandmother, who was Ukrainian, and so that's a kind of part of her narrative of it enters into her narrative later. She makes another film where she goes to Ukraine called My Babushka, and goes to visit the land of her ancestors, the land of her grandmother, who emigrated to the US when she was 13. And in this film, Optic Nerve, there's this sense of that the possibility of being also extends to the waning of the senses, the aging of the body, illness and infirmity and vulnerability. And in this, it sort of attempts to align with the experience of the grandmother who is losing her sight and is in a home and is in a nursing home. And she visits her and shoots some footage of the grandmother, just moving very slowly across a hallway, and uses these optical printing strategies, of which this slide is a sort of poor representation of it, but uses the optical printing strategies to speak about the waning of perception, as that kind of the questions of decay, bodily decay and limits, is also bound up with a real sense of kind of empathy and intimacy. And we also see this in a film like Sanctus, where she's interested in imaging technologies themselves, in which the kind of ailing body is inscribed through these medical technologies, but also the technology also has this strange seductive power. And here we have this almost strange image of a woman putting on lipstick, while also it kind of being documented by the X-ray. And she was quite interested in some of the inventors of the X-ray, which she explored in other films. So this is kind of very research-driven as well. And this connects to the film we're going to watch tonight, which is a shift in her films that happens in the early 90s. So if in the 70s and into the 80s, Hammer was making work, kind of observational work at this small scale, short films, using different strategies and techniques. In the early 90s, she shifts, and that kind of an important shift is into documentary and nonfiction forms, even though one can think of her earlier films as also kind of within the continuum of nonfiction, in which she's making films that draw on found footage, draw on historical archives, and represent a process of historical research and reconstitution of these occluded sites of history. And this, I think, that notion of touching connects to this notion of wanting to be close to the past, or wanting to connect with the past, which we see in an essay that Ron Gregg wrote, where he talks about her documentaries and nonfiction works, which use archival materials quite profusely. And so Ron Gregg talks about this notion of the Hammer's desire to touch the past, which we'll see in Nitrate Kisses, in which he writes that, while many queer historians frustratingly find marginalia, lack, erasure, she queerly finds plenty. Her engagement with the lesbian past celebrates and highlights rebelliousness, agency, creativity, queer kinship and passion. And so that sense of like that contact with the historical past is something that connects us to Nitrate Kisses, which was a film made in the wake of a number of transformations that are historical in an era of AIDS and ACT UP and the culture wars and right-wing assaults on publicly funded arts. In interviews, she'd called it one of her favorite, if not her own favorite work. And it's part of a loose history trilogy of films that she made in this period, which include the film's tender fictions and history lessons, and came in a moment that saw the emergence of what Beaver B. Rich inaugurated as a new queer cinema, of which Hammer's film, this film, is on the bleeding edge. And it is clearly a departure. It was a feature, her first feature-length film. It was a departure from her earlier works like Didactics, Bedtime, Audience, which emphasizes close observation in this move to found footage as a practice. And in its attention to fragmentary absences and holes in the record of social and cinematic history around lesbian and gay male life, it's in many ways an extension of her larger practice of an embodied and materialist approach to social reality and its recording. In an epigraph in the film, we see the title, "Who is the Angel of History?" It evokes the grim and poetic writing of the Frankfurt School's Walter Benjamin, who visions the progresses of history as always necessitating an angel who looks backward while being blown forward by the winds of change, seeing the wreckage of the past and the victims and casualties of the historical victor pile up like debris behind him. Constructed from a wide range of footage and sound from many sources that spans from her own interviews with lesbians in their 60s and 70s discussing life before Stonewall, footage of ruined and abandoned spaces, documentation of Willa Cather's home, archival objects such as lesbian pulp fiction, as well as footage of protest and tenderly shot footage of 4 couples having sex in front of the camera. This was Hammer's treatise on the possibility of thinking and materializing queer history as a living practice, one shared by both filmmaker and spectator, inviting, as she said in interviews, the viewer to become an archaeologist. In that active sense, Hammer's film extended the practice of rewriting and summoning histories from the cracks and silences of the official record. In this, she joined the ranks with writers like Vito Russo and Parker Tyler in unearthing sexual representation in cinema as a contradictory rich archive. Never sundering and always fusing the relationship between public visibility and private selves, Hammer foregrounds the centrality of sexuality to gay and lesbian life, as well as the force of its political assertion as a radical act of self-making. It presents the erotics of the archive and an archive of lesbian and gay erotics, even in and through its constitutive gaps and absences. And she weaves together layers of filmic time within it, linking personal narratives of specific subjects with tales of Cather's hidden lesbianism, with narratives of lesbian life in the Nazi camps, as filtered through the archival restitution of historians and eyewitness testimony, and astonishing outtakes of the 1933 experimental film by James Sibley Watson called Lot in Sodom, which was the first gay experimental film. Hammer challenged us to look at, challenges us to think of the co-implications of these temporal folds, palimpsests and experiences, and what forces of repression and oppression, cultural, economic, social, and psychic, are perpetuated by social institutions, but also those which operated within the lesbian and gay community. In filming scenes of tender sexual encounter, Hammer also focused on the opacities and blockages and blind spots around specific groups, giving space and erotic voice to the concern of aging lesbians and their sexual expression, as well as interracial couples and the challenges they face. For example, the filmmakers and artists Peter Kramer and Jack Waters, as well as women of color and BDSM practitioners. And how she films these moments recalls many of her methods and stylistic imprints from her sexually explicit 70s work, a closeness to the bodies of the subjects and a participatory, energetic lens. Never impervious to self-critique, she reflected later on the questions of aging in the film. What still has not been seen much is the aging woman's body, which I'm very aware of because I am the aging woman's body. And if we think about the fact that she came out in the 70s and she was in her 30s already. So in the 90s, she's already in her 50s. And so what still has not been seen is the aging body, and she says that we have two old women making love, but that isn't the aged body. They're still glorified in their chiaroscuro lighting, filmed in beautiful black and white. We've never really accepted the wrinkle as the sign of lived experience. And so this penchant for the tactile imprint and self-inscription is often left in the image itself, as in the case of her shadow or reflection being visible in the frame, which we see in a lot of her work, a figuring of yet another absent presence that guides and mediates what we see. And it's full of images of great joy, which is emblematic of her robust, energetic gaze, women dancing, the camp of Sibley Watson's outtakes, the play of couples accustomed to each other in a rhythmic harmony with each other's bodies. There's the delight that Hammer takes in mingling historical material, producing this frisson or friction of the queer historiographer. No scene makes this more felt than perhaps the appearance of the Hollywood production code. I won't give it away, but alongside an image that, which is an irony in which she uses this instrument of censorship in the Hollywood period on top of an image of sexual encounter, which I'll wait for you to encounter on your own. And I think that this theorization of temporality is rather important to this film and to the films that come after it, that emerge in its wake in Hammer's filmography, in which she talks about this notion of the historical past and the way of thinking about the frictions, the intermingling of this kind of nonlinear notion of history in which the past times reverberate, in which she talks about time as an emotional muscle. She's saying that, and she says that part of gay culture that continues, remnants of the past that continue into the present, that is one way of thinking about time. And she hopes that audiences leave the cinema experiencing the world differently. So Nitrate Kisses in its title itself, or nitrate referring to the material of the medium, indicates a fusion or exchange of two contradictory elements, the contact between combustible filmic material and the corporeal body, sealed together in an erotic act of detonating force, right? Because nitrate would often explode if it was left in particular heat conditions, right? So there are many nitrate fires if it's not preserved properly. And so time, in Hammer's, pointing to the incendiary and the intimate, the abstract and the erotic, Hammer's camera seals its place in the smooching histories of incongruous materials, inviting and never forswearing the friction of future possibilities for collective and personal transformation. Time is an emotional muscle indeed, and it can flex itself forward, projecting itself into new, unimagined worlds. I might, as we're at 7:23, I might end it there and leave you, there's a lot more to say about late life, but I'll leave you with this statement at the beginning of Hammer's biography and book of writing called Hammer, Making Movies Out of Sex and Life, which is inscribed in the beginning of this book, in which she says, "For women artists everywhere, may your pleasures in creating be huge, your path sound, your fears vanished, your success is valued, yours is the future I write for." So maybe I'll end it there. Thank you.